Good afternoon. This is the Board of Standards and Appeals Public Review Session for April 7th, 2020, 2 p.m. session. The following case will be discussed, 2019-205BZ, 485 Van Cinderon Avenue, Brooklyn. This is a public review session. Please do not call in yet. When the hearing starts, we will notify you and you can call in.
Okay. Very challenged. Okay, we have proof of service of initial application to officials and of notice of hearing to officials and neighbors. Community Board recommends approval with 2 abstentions. On the hardship issue related to environmental contamination, I want to ask, the statement of findings at page 2 refers to a statement of fact dated 1/6/16. Is that date a typo? Is there actually such a thing? There isn't any mention in the statement of facts of a 1/16 that's dated 1/16/20 of the track 4 requirements. It just talks about the contamination, but it doesn't talk about what track it's in. I'd like to understand also what document indicates the track 4 cleanup requirement and the scope of work. I looked through many of the environmental documents. The only mention I saw was of track 1 and 2. I never saw a mention of track 4. What does it mean also, as stated in, I think it was in the statement of facts, quote, no soil source was identified, unquote. I think that might be a typo. I don't know what that means. I agree, though, that this site's location is very odd relative to its frontage on only 15-foot wide Van Cinderon and the cantilever of the elevated subway, which is the case for only 2 blocks of Van Cinderon's length, which otherwise widens to 25 feet, which isn't much better, but it's 10 feet wider than this. So you do have real access issues from Van Cinderon for almost any purpose. The site is now vacant. In terms of the uniqueness finding, are there other vacant sites similarly burdened in the M11 along Van Cinderon? I didn't see that in the uniqueness discussion. On the question of deference, I would like to understand better. This is the low-income housing deference question under Catholic Charities. I'd like to understand better what CCM's experience is as an affordable housing developer, not as a manager or operator. The Catholic Charities case made clear that deference is available only to experienced not-for-profit low-income housing developers, and there's a good reason for this. The idea is not to encourage inexperienced developers to come through this and then not be able to complete the projects. And we have had some exposure to one developer who had a very bad track record. And so I'm concerned about the ability of this applicant to actually move forward on an application. And I don't want, and obviously this type of a variance is not transferable because you must meet all the criteria of the variance. It's not something you can sell in the marketplace. There is a statement that in the statement of findings that this unit count is the only one that will work under the financing structure. On what is that statement based? They actually gave us a kind of a breakdown saying if it were 125 units, they wouldn't have the profit loss margin met, but they didn't provide really any backup for that. It's just sort of conclusory. This site is in the East New York Industrial Business Zone. I see Commissioner Otley Brown's hand up. I would like a letter from City Council member opining on this, as I am loath to encourage residential uses in such zones, except when they are on the perimeters. And this one falls sort of right in the center of the very skinny zone. And one reason that I mention this is because the that specific city council member met with the board in a private meeting saying, you know, don't touch my industrial business zones. So I just want to make sure that, I don't know if it's the same council member today, but I want to make sure that they're aware of this case. But at the same time, I understand that this is a very odd site surrounded by residential and non-industrial uses and may not have been appropriately located within the IBZ. It's kind of an odd, they may have included this because it's a way to make continuity from one end of the IBZ to another, and that's how it got included. I'm going to recognize Commissioner Otley Brown. I have more comments, but I know that she's asking about my comment earlier about the
Yes. Did you see the detailed financing statement? It's about 30 pages or 20 pages.
I was leaving that to you to figure out.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that you did know that they did put that in.
Okay. Okay. So we'll I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, you could do that. Hand it to me later.
Thank you, though. I don't know if it's in the financing statement, but we need a copy of the regulatory agreement with HPD indicating 60% of AMI for 100% of the project is 60% of AMI for the life of the building. If there is not a regulatory agreement already executed, then we need a restrictive declaration, which is our standard, which commits the building to that for life. Van Sinderen is a very, very narrow way, further reduced by the height of the elevated train that cantilevers over it. The building has been pulled back 15 feet from the curb line, which appears to be coincident with the property line. And it's unclear how far from the edge of the cantilever that is. So the fire department should review its access from there. The site survey does not provide any road or cantilever clear widths for Van Sinderen, and this should be provided. I'm concerned about the fire trucks crashing into the cantilever, and that maybe the building should slide back. There's one of the statements was that the fire department could fight the fire from the street Snedeker, but that's a very long distance, and it would require fire department to go inside the Snedeker building to fight the fire in the Van Sinderen building, which doesn't sound right. That's fire department's call, but doesn't sound right. The site is a brownfield site due to contamination from chemicals used for a furniture factory. The proposed use is residential, and the contaminated soil removal, according to what I understand, is only 2 feet below grade. So I don't understand how that fits in the type 1 to 4 cleanup range, and how that's appropriate for residential occupancy. That's pretty confusing to me. I need more on that. On the issue of the setback from the property line, which according to section 4344 in an M11 should be set back 15 feet using the alternate setback regulations. And then above that, above 30 feet with a 1.4 to 1 sky exposure plane, not set back 20 feet to 1 sky exposure plane, and a 15-foot base height as stated in the statement of facts. So I think the statement of facts is incorrect about what the standard is for an alternate setback building, which is how this is being handled. Or it's a quality housing building. It's very confusing to me what they're using as a standard. But in any event, isn't a straight rise without a setback, which is what they're proposing, forcing the residents into too much vibration and noise and their windows right up against the passing trains. And I'm wondering, wouldn't it be better to reduce the depth of the rear yard, for example, where, for example, it functions effectively as a through lot with the adjoining residential development at Beverly Place in most of it. And if you slid the whole thing back, providing maybe a 20-foot rear yard, then you'd be further away from the trains because most of the windows are facing, or half the windows are facing right at the train tracks. And I'm curious, for instance, what the building on the corner of Livonia did relative to its proximity to the elevated trains. you know, I was thinking in terms of the design of this project, I actually don't think it's the kind of, it's the right design for this project. This is the sort of site where a double loaded corridor isn't the way to go, as you really want the units facing the rear and accessed from a single loaded corridor along the noisy side. So normally what you'd have is, say, an outdoor or a separate corridor, and everybody walks into the building from the noisy side and then comes into what are sort of long, narrow units that face onto the courtyard. So the approach here was kind of a standard approach, as if never having visited the site. And then they should explain the purpose of the ground floor uses and how they meet the need for air support, AIRS, AIRS support space under the section 1210 definition of AIRS. They do tell you what those spaces are, but not telling you how they're specifically air support spaces. And that's, and in terms of the floor area related to them, there's a particular requirement under AIRS that they provide a certain amount of square footage. And I also don't understand the zoning chart that was provided that's showing some R6 quality housing and some AIRS requirements like mixing and matching, but not all, and not all of them showing compliance, and showing compliance with some and not with others. I don't understand why the project doesn't comply with R6 quality housing and AIRS requirements entirely. Like, why can't it just do that? With these type of deference cases, I'm sorry, I have a lot of comments. With these types of deference cases, because we have been unable to obtain New York City supplied expertise on housing development finance, which might be applicable to the minimum variance finding, understanding that they submitted this financial, but we have asked for city expertise on this subject. Instead of that, because we can't get it, we have been looking to neighborhood character as the best solution to determining the minimum variance. So in that vein, the neighborhood character vein, if the R6 is the closest residential district and the maximum FAR there is 3.9, then why are they asking essentially for 10 4 FAR? And also the proposed project is 9 stories and 95 feet tall, whereas of all the residential buildings that they cite in the study area on this side of the tracks, the tallest building appears to be 74 feet tall. So how does this fit within neighborhood character? They actually need to address that question and not rely on a tower that's on the other side of the tracks, which is another neighborhood. And what about the impact of this building on the one family homes to the rear? They don't discuss that at all, or how they'll mitigate that. They should also explain, and this is another reason why I think the building isn't really designed with sort of the community in mind. There's an elevator on the south side that only stops at the cellar first and roof levels. What is that? And then this is another application for AIRS housing, which we've seen before, where the corridor is very long for a building to be occupied by people with compromised walking ability. Some tenants will be walking almost 200 feet to get from the elevator to their front doors. I'd like to know whether there's been HPD sign off on the building layout and apartment layouts. And I've raised this at every one of these applications, because normally we don't have sign off from HPD on the layouts. And we had a case recently where the applicant came back to us after it was decided because HPD had disagreed with the layouts. So I don't want to move forward with something where HPD has not agreed that the layouts are correct, especially with a 200-foot long corridor. And also, if there are drop-offs for the tenants by accessoride or some other thing, wouldn't they be pulling into that turnaround zone that's provided at the corner of the site? And wouldn't it therefore make sense to have access to that elevator at the south? So there's a lot of things where I'm finding a disconnect. The statement of fact states that tenants can access from Snedeker through the Beverly building, but that's an even longer access route for the disabled. I think the project is actually assuming very able walking tenants or tenants in wheelchairs with attendants, and I don't know if that's a fair reality. So I have to say I'm not getting a lot of the programmatic decisions on the design of the project. They need to provide building sections. We didn't get any sections. They need to show all results of the EAS on the drawings with respect to hazmat, air quality, and noise protection. And the last letter on noise is February 4th with an instruction for correction on, and on air quality, we do have a sign off January 7th, and we have a shadow sign off. And I don't see, as I said earlier, where DEC has instructed that 2 feet of the soil be removed or that a track 4 remediation level is appropriate for the use. And those were my comments. So I'll just go in order, even though I know that Commissioner Otley Brown has the financial issue. So Commissioner Shanda.
Okay. So I want to give a little bit of a background of this area, and I think it is important for us to know that and keep that in mind as we review this project. Back in 2013, City Planning Commission and City Council had adopted a rezoning of the frontage of Livonia Avenue up to Van Sinderen and Pennsylvania. This is part of the HPD's urban renewal area. There were a lot of city-owned sites along Livonia and Van Sinderen, but for this site, subject site that we are discussing. And the purpose of this rezoning and amendment to the urban renewal plan was to encourage more affordable housing along Livonia and Van Sinderen, recognizing that we have these elevated subway track systems. So Livonia also has an elevated subway track, and so does Van Sinderen. And I was at the site. I was involved in this project back then, and I went to the site just to see what's going on. And I have to say, pretty much all the sites that was under HPD jurisdiction along Livonia Avenue have been built. And the one at the corner of Van Sinderen and Livonia is nearing completion. It's fully topped out. It's nearing completion. And this is one building, I think, of all the 5 buildings that have been developed, is the one that has 2 elevated subway system. And all of these buildings have, as part of the Livonia Avenue rezoning, have to provide all the necessary, window wall attenuation and alternate means of ventilation to minimize the sound issues and construction accordingly. So just keep that in your mind as you look at Van Sinderen. And these are as of right residential that allow R7 density and more.
Oh, 7? I thought there were, so why?
No, Livonia Avenue was rezoned to R7A from R6, and to allow affordable mixed-use housing.
So why is the
So the corner of Livonia up to the depth of, I think, 150 or so is mapped to R7A and C4-4L.
So then why is the applicant using R6 as their?
Because the section that is R6 is along the Snedeker Avenue. 100 feet from Livonia is R6.
Oh, so mid-block is R6.
The mid-block is R6, but the avenue frontage of Livonia was upzoned to R7A. And the idea, I mean, initially the idea was to kind of take this along and map the higher density along where you have the elevated structures to allow for them to be able to build above the structure and allow for a zoning envelope that gives you the flexibility and not have a contextual envelope, so that you are boxed into a quality housing building form, tower on a base type of thing, or a high base with a setback much higher up. This allowed for flexibility to set back even more along the street frontage, which is what all the Livonia Avenue buildings have done. They have set the building back from the Livonia Avenue frontage, and have gone up and then set back a little further up. Each one has taken a different methodology, but the idea was to allow for a little bit more street frontage along Livonia Avenue, because there is an overhang. The Snedeker one, this side, it's worse because it's not only the elevated subway, but that's where the subway station is. So the subway platform is extending out over to Van Snedeker, and there's a clearance of just barely about 12 feet from the structure to the street.
Right. So, but you said, wow, it's 12 feet. So that's not a fire truck, right? You're talking about the height?
The clearance height that is there. I mean, if you do Google Map, you will see there is a photo that that says 12 foot 2 inches is the clearance height from the elevated structure of the cantilevered platform to grade.
12 feet from the bottom. That you can get from Google.
Yeah, actually, I was in the site, so I can even send you the photo of what I took, but I think one of their photos also captures it.
No, I know that there's a cantilever, but how do you know the actual height?
There is a sign that says 12 foot 2 inch clearance.
Wow. Okay.
If you're just at the site and you do a Google Street View, you'll see that sign.
Okay, under the cantilever. So you said I don't think that's what you meant to say. You said the rezoning for Livonia was done to encourage more frontage.
So there were two things that were done. One, the Livonia was to allow for more upzoning, so allow for more density to get more affordable housing on the city-owned side. The other thing was also to allow for the building form to be such so that they could set back from the property line.
Okay.
So that it allows for a wider street frontage on Livonia. The building can set back from the elevated subway line that is also running along Livonia. And so those were the two, some of the urban design elements, if you want to think of it, that was factored in.
Okay, so that's my question to the applicant, like the design of this rising straight up, only using a very minimal setback from the street line doesn't seem to be urbanistically the same approach as what they did on Livonia, you know?
Actually, this is very consistent with what Livonia did.
It is?
So yeah, because Livonia, the setbacks, I think they were required to have a 10-foot setback, and here the building is setting back more than that from its property line. In this case, it happens to be the property line right up to where there is no sidewalk. So the property goes right up to the street. So it's setting back 20 feet from 20 feet, oh no, 15 feet. It's setting back 15 feet from the property line. And then it's going up. And then it is maintaining a rear yard of 30 feet. Now, if we are okay with the rear yard of 20 feet, you know, that's a different story. But I think they were trying to go with something that would be acceptable, try to reduce the amount of waiver. And you're right. I think the analysis should be clear as to which bulk form is being applied. I think the way it's written like as if it's a standard height and setback. But in this case, the alternate height and setback can be applied, and should be analyzed accordingly.
I mean,
but sorry,
this is an M11, so of course there are no bulk regulations. If they were
that
going
is true.
to create
That is true.
the design, they could set back in all different kinds of ways to get the form of this building to be more compatible with the
right.
situation.
So just to go back, I think all the buildings on Livonia, as I said, they're also fronting on along a subway line, and they're all double-loaded corridors. So you have apartments that front Livonia, and then there are apartments that front away from that have that from the rear yard. Mm-hmm. That's typical of it, and typically you would require for window wall attenuation and alternate means of ventilation.
Right, of course. Okay.
So I just wanted to use that as a base so that we have an understanding of how this neighborhood is changing, and and what was the thought process behind it when these developments were being considered. So my first question is, based on the HPD design guidelines, the recommended unit sizes are 500 to 550 square feet. And the proposed unit sizes are much larger. And going to the same question that Chair had raised, is there any reason for maintaining a larger unit size? As we know, in the charity case, Catholic Charity, the applicant came back and requested a reduction in the number of, in the unit sizes to allow for more units. And I think this does require them to get a very informal nod, if not a formal nod, because I know HPD will not review this plan until it has gotten all the necessary approvals, and they will do the rigorous review of each of the unit layouts and of the configuration. If it is possible for them to get a nod from HPD design team to see, and from the finance team, is if they would want to see a unit size that is larger than 500 and 550 square feet, or would they want to see something that's a little bit less and thereby may allow for a little bit more units. So I think it would be worth it for them to get an informal nod, and a letter from HPD support, I think supportive housing unit to that effect would be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, the requests from HPD were more extreme than that. Those are just some of the requests. So that's one on the changing of that case. And then there were things we just couldn't allow.
Right. Yes.
We right. said that if they needed to change the things the way they thought that they instructed to, they'd have to come back for a new variance.
Right.
And nobody wants to do that.
Right. I'm quite familiar with, but I think this one, it's rather simple. In this one, it's more of unit size. And, would HPD, when they do a lot of the time, when they start doing the rigorous review, often they will say, well, why are you proposing such larger unit size? Why aren't you sticking to what our required unit sizes are, what our recommended unit sizes are, which is 500 to 550 square feet. And maybe you can get on each floor one additional floor, one unit. And that improves the financing, that also addresses the need for the housing. So it would be helpful if you could get a read on that.
Right. Plus, another part of this is those units on the ground floor. I mean, we've seen this in other kinds of housing. The ground floor units in this case, because they're right up against their, it's not very ideal to be those ground floor units. Sometimes what you do is you forego any floor area down there. You just don't actually have structure down there, or you make it parking or something like that, so that they could move those units to an upper level facing the rear or something. I just feel like the design isn't really being responsive to the site. Especially in this case, because none of the ones on Livonia are facing a 15-foot wide, 12-foot high cantilever, right? It's a much different relation.
It's a little bit wider. Yes, Livonia is a little bit wider.
So, and you see, and they're much more, let's say, substantial structures than this long, skinny thing. So I'm thinking, be a little more creative on your site. And don't just build basically what looks like, could be anywhere, sort of the spaceship landed. Anything else?
Yes, I do actually have a lot of comments. Okay. So the proposed area identified for accessory space, as I reviewed it, I thought it was reasonable, but they do have to meet the air's space analysis. But from a programmatic point of view, from what I have seen, at least back then, and I don't know if that still applies today at HPD, this seemed like a reasonable amount of space that is being requested for the various support spaces. With that said, CCM is also operating Beverly's Place, which abuts the subject site. It's facing Snedeker, and it was built yesterday. It's a beautifully designed building, and it has gotten awards. And this place also is a permanent supportive housing for 72 units. And so my question is, does it have its own separate caseworkers, and or will there be a sharing of caseworkers between the Beverly's Place and the subject case? And will there be some common services that will be provided that both of these facilities will be sharing? I feel the answer is no, but I would like the applicant to clarify it, because the population that is served, that is residing in Beverly's Place is different. Even though it's supportive housing, that's a younger population and the idea there is to provide more job seeking and other things, whereas here it's a senior population. So their needs are slightly different. And I think they need more support services, healthcare and other facilities. So, but I would like the applicant to clarify that and in their narrative. So it would be good if they can provide the benefits of the two facilities, but at the same time, why they have to remain independent and the kind of services they're providing. They need to need to be explicit in the application and justify each of the waiver that they are seeking. The application has not been clear. They need to go through each one of the zoning resolution section and indicate why they are needing those waivers. And why programmatically, therefore, it is needed. It is the other part with regards to the as of right statement. The applicant has used the site contamination as an argument for the M-use operation. I find that a difficult argument for an as of right use, especially in an M district. You know, you're allowed to have commercial manufacturing uses. So if there is when there is contamination, the level of cleanup that would be needed in a manufacturing or in a commercial building would be a lot less than if it was a residential. And I do not know if also a track for cleanup would be required for a site if it were to remain as a manufacturing site. So I think that argument is not a good argument for why an as of right development, it becomes a hardship for an as of right development. However, the narrow street condition, the elevated subway that cantilevers over with a 12-foot clearance is not a desirable place for manufacturing use and for truck maneuverability and other things. So I think that's a very solid, strong argument to be made. But the environmental one, the contamination one, I'm not convinced, and I think they should eliminate that. With regards to, again, it's the same argument where the premium cost of environmental cleanup for as of right. I'm not sure that needs to be discussed in a different way. It is a cost of developing a residential building on this. That is different, but I don't know if that's a uniqueness. That's just, I'm not sure about. Overall, the applicant, I think, meets the finding in terms of the neighborhood character. The proposed development would be in scale and character with the surrounding uses, which is predominantly residential use. As I mentioned, the rezoning of the Livonia Avenue allowed for taller buildings, allowed for more dense building. The proposed development maintains that built context. And given the unusual site location where the site extends to the street line, without a city sidewalk, the proposed setback of 15 foot from the property line allows for a 10-foot wide sidewalk and an 8-foot wide drop-off area to prevent any traffic congestion along Van Snedeker. And since the development is located adjacent to a cantilever elevated structure, it has to set the building back to the extent possible while maintaining a 30-foot rear yard. And here, if we think we are okay with allowing for a reduced rear yard, they could ask for a bigger setback in the front. I'm okay with that. But thinking we wouldn't, I made the statement. The proposed height at this location would also act as a noise buffer to the residential homes east of the site that are located along the other street, I think Snedeker Street, yeah. And the surrounding residential districts are R7, R6, and AIR's FAR is R6, in an R6 district is 3.9 FAR. And in an R7, it's 5.01 FAR. And the applicant is proposing a 3.99 FAR, which is an increase of 0.09 FAR. So given the extent of the site cleanup, the addition of 0.09 FAR is reasonable. And I would like the applicant to confirm that 0.19 is what they would need to make it all financially viable also. Even though I know that's not one of the elements, but that's just a narrative. That's all I have to say.
That's good. Okay, Commissioner Ollie Brown.
So as to the Cornell deference bulk waiver, page 5 of the financing statement says that the support spaces and amenities will not only be for Jean's Place residents, but also for the surrounding community. So to me, this means that they would have to prove that the size of the support space and amenities is not overly sized so that it would be able to accommodate the community, but appropriately sized for the building, because the programmatic needs is based on the building project, not the entire community. So they need to show how the support space per tenant is actually equal to other developments and not more. Let's see, as to the contamination and the premium construction costs of the 5.47 million, I just had a few questions. Number one, have they been made whole by the previous owner and contaminator? 2, is this required for an industrial or commercial use, or is it just related to the proposed residential? And 3, what portion of the construction costs would be required for an as-of-right use if the answer to the second question is no, it's not required for industrial and commercial use. Then also I had a question because they talk about how an as-of-right building couldn't generate enough rental income to overcome both the premium costs as well as the increased vacancy due to the unattractiveness of the site. My question was, how much of the premium costs are actually generated because they have determined they want to build a cellar in the as-of-right? And then as to the minimal variance, they gave us a very extensive financial statement. The major ideas behind it, I get. I would say definitely the intricacies are a little harder for me to understand, but I think on a whole, the large amount of units allows them to share the cost of the common building systems amongst all of the units, making unit cost and per unit maintenance much lower, thereby making the project more attractive to lenders. They then go through 130 units, 125 units, 115, and they show that while 130 units, all sources of funding close the gap for development costs, and that if you decrease the units, the cost per unit goes up slightly, but then that actually puts a hole or a funding gap in place that grows larger with the least amount of units. My question is, when you have a gap in the capital funding, what does that mean? For the applicant, does that mean that they have to close that gap with another funding source that has higher interest rates? Could they give us an explanation as to that? That would be helpful. And that's all I have.
That's good, thank you. Interest rate, okay. Okay, can you just go back over the your questions about the contamination? You're saying, would the contamination remediation be required the same level for a commercial use?
Yes. And then if the question is no, then what portion of it is due to having a cellar? Okay. So what's driving the hardship for the as of right, basically?
Okay. Thank you. All right. Commissioner Sheta.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to start from where Commissioner Brown finished. It sounds like the contamination is focused at the top 2 feet of the subsurface. So I'm not sure if eliminating the cellar is going to, adding a cellar or eliminating a cellar is going to change the situation that much. But definitely, if they consider something other than the residential use, I believe if they consider commercial, the criteria, the cleanup criteria for the commercial, of course, it's different from that for residential, and the cost might drop. Now, if we look at the cost, I did review 3 reports that they submitted. The first report was done in 2015 by Hillman, and the second one is by GEI in 2017. And finally, remedial investigation report by AKRF in 2019. Starting with the first one, the 2015 one, apparently they did the investigation around an existing building. They weren't able to drill inside. And the description in that report mentions that the contamination, if you look at the results in the testing of the samples extracted, you can easily figure out that there is no much contamination spread along the perimeter where they performed the borings. And actually, that was the first report I reviewed, and I was like, okay, if this is the case, we don't have too much contamination. And then when I moved to the other 2 reports, especially the final one, the 2019 one, it sounds like the contamination is everywhere within the building limits. If you wanna take a look at what I'm looking at, this is the report by AKRF, and I'm looking at page 54. It's a chart. It's showing the locations for the borings and the samples, and it's given the contaminants figures, how much contaminants they got, and how deep was that. And like I said, typically all the borings that contamination was detected in them, the contaminants was like 2 feet below grade. So I'm not sure if the contamination is just 2 feet, why the cost is 5.5 million. That's a lot. And I tried to understand, to follow the breakdown that they provided in their financial statement, and I wasn't able to. So I'm not sure if they can provide us with some breakdown for that 5.5 million, more detailed than the one that they provided so far. That probably is going to help us figure out whether this number is suitable or not. The other thing is, I saw an application or a letter to the Brownfield program back in 2018, I believe. Are they becoming a member of that program? Are they getting any funding from this? And the final thing I would say is that based on the report by Hillman in 2015, they described the past use of the building as for furniture and wood manufacturing. I have seen too many gas station locations, and I wasn't able to see that much contamination on site. So I'm not sure why. I'm afraid that it was something wrong with the second investigation, maybe, but it's their call. If I would alert them that if we gonna grant something, it's gonna be conditioned on performing the cleanup that they're gonna claim that they need to do.
What do you mean you're not sure why? You're wondering why it was admitted into the program, into the program?
No, I'm asking them, were they admitted? Are they getting any funds from that program?
Right. But you're not wondering why they would go for the program. If they were admitted, you're not wondering why they're admitted. I didn't understand. the last thing.
No, I wouldn't. If they were admitted, I wouldn't be surprised based on the output from the AKRF report, the 2019 remedial investigation report. It shows contamination all over the place. But like I said, the good thing is the contaminants are just 2 feet. So if they just, and the site is 25,000 almost, let's say 27,000 square foot. If you're digging 2 feet, this is 2,000 cubic yards, almost, even less. So digging 2,000 cubic yards of even contaminated material, if the contamination is everywhere, and it's not, I don't think it needs to plug in the construction cost 5.5 million as premium for cleanup. I really believe that this number is exaggerated, and that's why I'm alerting them. If they like insist on plugging this number in the equation, what we're gonna do is we're gonna condition our grant to the scope of the cleanup, and if they don't do it, they will lose it.
Well, I mean, you know, I do want to say though that we could be looking at this application just as a sort of, for lack of a better word, the sort of the Cornell doctrine deference.
Yes.
Not have to rely on the contamination. Initially,
I would love to.
so initially I was thinking that, you know, the site was contaminated until this report. I mean, I've seen this in a pre-application meeting where I learned about, or actually not that, working with the project manager, seeing how the project was being, the notice of comments was going out, and I wasn't aware of contamination on the site initially, right? So, but I was looking at the site as this weird, narrow site fronting on this skinny, barely a roadway with this cantilever and so on. And kind of the only way to get to it really is from the street that's parallel to it. So it had enough problems, right? So to throw contamination into the mix seems really unnecessary.
Yep. Thank you.
Actually, would recommend for the applicant not to harp on the contamination aspect, but focus on the other unique conditions about the site, and the fact that we do have a deference provision, provided that they qualify for low-income housing, 60% AMI, 100% permanent for life of building.
If it need to be hung on the contamination, it's going to be conditioned. If it could fly without it, it's much better situation than, you know, arguing about something that they can just forget about.
Right. Okay.
Everybody's breaking up or freezing.
Who is?
It was NASA, and then you were freezing.
Is there anything that we have to say again?
No, he blocked out a word or something, but I think he's fine.
No, I'm fine. From my side, I can like listen, hear, and I can see like without any breakage.
I'm asking because I want to make sure that it was understandable during the live stream. Is Steve monitoring the live stream?
Yes, I believe.
Yes, the connection is good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay.
So it can be your connection, Tani.
Okay.
Never mind. Okay.
Do you have anything else, Commissioner Shetta?
No, thank you.
Okay, and I see Commissioner Shanda has her hand up, but I'm going to go quickly to Commissioner Shibeta, who hasn't spoken.
Thank you, Chair. So I do want them to brief why they believe they're entitled to Cornell deference, because this isn't exactly like the Catholic Charities case, and I believe the chair mentioned something to that regard earlier. So I would like them to brief that. I'm glad that the other board members are also not convinced with the environmental cleanup argument. I think Commissioner Champa said it best with that they would need to do more work if this was less work. They need to do more work because it's residential, as opposed to what they would have to do if it stayed within its actual use. I do want to know if there was any recoupment with regard to the environmental in any event. I want to know whether this contamination, they recouped in any way from this contamination.
Mhm.
I was satisfied with the neighborhood character argument. I do believe that if they're granted deference, I do believe their programmatic needs argument needs to be related to each one of the waivers that they're asking. I did not see that in their argument. And finally, the only thing I too had the same concerns with regard to how they opined fire department can address the particular lot. I think that that's something I'd like to hear from fire department and see what they're okay with, as opposed to taking their word for it.
Okay. Anything else?
You know, I don't want to be repetitive. I do understand a lot of the statements that were made about the this actual type of building, whether this is the appropriate for this location. But I'm not gonna be duplicative.
Okay. When you say appropriate, you mean the use or the shape?
The shape and whether or not this building is the best building for what they're trying to get in this location. As you stated earlier, it looks like it could have been dropped there from anywhere. You know, does this really address is it really in light of where it's located?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Okay, and I just want to point out that in terms of the waivers, the actual only waiver is use, because residential is not permitted on this site at all. So, and then we look at the parameters of the use request and say, the way they presented it, the parameters are an R6, but as Commissioner Shanda pointed out, you could also argue it's an R7A. So, but it's not really a waiver in those cases. It's more like that's the closest equivalent, right? Okay, all right. And so Commissioner Shanda has her hand up.
Thank you. Has everybody seen the document that was submitted on 10/2/2019? It's a letter from New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. It's basically the fully executed brownfield cleanup agreement between the applicant and New York State, dated November 28, 2018.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted, because that's a fully executed terms and conditions of the brownfield, and there is a tax credit associated with the brownfield cleanup also.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing I would recommend for Ms. Benke is to coordinate with HPD Environmental, because as part of the HPD financing, they also look towards to ensure that, you know, if there's any contamination, site will be cleaned up, and all environmental reviews, everything has been done. So to ensure there is no repetition of review, that one review can take care of both the issues. So if there's that coordination happening, that would be great. And we can get some ideas from them also in terms of what is the minimum standard and other requirements they look for, especially with regards to cleanup of sites for residential use.
This is coordination with which
HPD's environmental.
But they haven't, on none of these cases do we see environmental.
They would not take the lead because this is not an HPD on site, but they would require if, let's say, this was a clean site, or it did not require a waiver. Let's say it did not require a waiver, but it did require cleanup. And but it was proposing an affordable housing and needed all the financing from State Housing Development Corporation and City HPD. They would have to meet all the environmental approvals. So they would have to do either the state SECRA or the city SECRA.
Right, but
to get so there are all those other environments. So it might be worth it to kind of let them know that this review is going on. I'm just throwing it out there.
So let Tracy jump in if I can find her. There she is. Hold on a second. But I want to say that it's not before those. Why can't I unmute you? Unmute yourself.
Yes.
Okay. You know, I doubt that this is before any of the finance agencies. So we function as lead, and when they start their environmental review, they see that there's lead agency, and then they take our determination and kind of incorporate it. At the moment, I don't think they're involved agencies because I don't think it's before them. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tracy.
I have to check. Usually they do adopt our decision or sometimes go beyond our decision, but we can check in with them.
Right. So, right. So we often have these situations where they come to, the applicant comes to us, but it's really premature relative to the funding agencies, right? So those funding agencies don't become involved agencies because they don't have anything before them yet, right?
Okay.
Mhm.
So, okay. Okay. Anything else anybody wants to add? Any hands up, any other ideas, anything? Okay, so we can switch.
Okay, so now that concludes the public review session for April 7th, 2020, at 2 p.m. session. We are now starting the public hearing for April 7th, 2020, 2 p.m. session. And the calendar number is 2019-205BZ, 485 Van Cinderon Avenue, Brooklyn. The applicants are Goldman Harris. Please call in. The number is on the screen, 646-558-8656.
So we have someone who's identified as iPhone and someone identified as, there was one more, I don't know what happened to that person. Just iPhone and guest. So whoever those people are, please identify yourselves. Oops.
Are they in?
They're in. Oh. And oops. I don't, so we have iPhone and guest. Apparently they left. And it's David Schnackenberg with a beard.
We put them back in the waiting room since they didn't identify themselves.
Okay, okay, thank you. Please identify yourself. Can you hear us? Mr. Schnackenberg. Oh, he's connecting, okay. So, yeah, you're not muted anymore. Can you hear us?
Hello.
Hello, please state your name. Turn your YouTube video.
David.
I can hear you, David Schnackenberg with Goldman Harris. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, sure your YouTube video is off.
Yes. Just really want to thank the board and your staff. This is amazing that this agency is the only agency that's operating in the city, and we appreciate it. The applicant appreciates it. The land use bar really appreciates it. So as my colleagues are working their way on, we just wanted to thank you guys. This is incredible.
Thank you
So-
for that acknowledgement. But to give a fair shout out, the Public Design Commission is also, they're also a little agency, very agile and able to jump onto it. There are 3 people waiting in the waiting room, one of which is Dee Shapiro. Is that person with you?
Yes.
Okay, so Kurt and Rachel Goodfriend.
Yes.
Okay, so that person, and how, there are 2 other people waiting who didn't identify themselves when we admitted them. So they went back into the waiting room. One has the title guest and the other one says iPhone. So
I believe that's Councilwoman Barron's chief of staff, as well as the applicant, principal of the applicant, Emery Brooks, and Howard Goldman with Goldman Harris is also, I believe, attempting to join the conference.
we also Ian Golub, who was just admitted. Is that sound right?
Our project architect, yes.
Okay, good. All right, maybe find out who these other 2 people, one more time, the guest and the iPhone are. We'll give them a second, but actually, I think, Mr. Schnackenberg, if you want to, oh, there we go. We have
Ian Golub, who was just admitted.
okay.
Rachel.
Our project architect, yes.
Okay.
Right, we find out who these are.
So everyone, please turn off your YouTube videos. Otherwise we get.
Okay.
Okay.
Bring your screen down.
Yeah, the person who's,
Mr. Brooks, can we
Yeah,
need to see your
Brooks,
face?
move your screen so we see your face. We see your light fixtures on your ceiling. Okay. Okay, so Tony, you want to?
Is everyone in though, David?
Howard Goldman from our offices is also joining. I know that he's working on it right now. If the board's able to give him another second, we'd appreciate it. If not, we will start.
Andrew is also trying to get in at the moment.
850, that's being admitted right now, whoever that is.
So
I don't know, waiting for Galaxy 850 to come in.
that, I believe, is our architect, Andrew. Janine, have you spoken with him?
I'm unmuting everybody on your team
Thank you.
if I can. There we go. Okay, so far we have of your team, Rachel Goodfriend, Dee Shapiro, who's this, Golub, is that iPhone?
Janine is, Golub is one of our project architects. Andrew Knox is trying to sign in. He's another project architect. And Howard Goldman
We don't see.
coming in.
Maybe you let Howard know that he needs to call in because we don't see him.
Yeah, no, I've sent him an email with the with the meeting ID and password.
What we're finding is sometimes you need to call them because they're not getting the message.
Okay, well, we don't want to hold we don't want to hold you all up. I will be
Started and they'll come in. We'll recognize them as they come in.
okay.
Okay, so let's swear them in.
Yes.
Okay, so we're on calendar number 2019-205BZ, 485 Van Sinderen Avenue, Brooklyn. So, gentlemen and ladies, raise your right hand. Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in your testimony before this board, and to respond honestly to board member questions?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
proceed, Mr. Schackenberg.
So first of all, thank you all. We heard your review session minutes ago. There are a number of questions that we are going to respond to, although I believe many of them are going to be responded to in writing so that we can think about them and respond thoughtfully. As I see it, there are sort of two major issues that we'd like to discuss with you today. One of them is going to have to do with the basis for the application. There was some indication from some commissioners that the environmental contamination is perhaps both a difficult and perhaps unnecessary justification for the variance. And we would like to confirm with you that we can sort of amend our process. And then of course, the project architect needs to respond to a lot of the questions and choices about building design, all of which were geared towards making this a smaller project that was asking for less waivers, fewer waivers and lesser waivers. Before we do that, however, and this responds to one of the initial comments made by the chair, I believe we have Councilwoman Baron's chief of staff here who would like to read a letter from the council member. And because it's an elected official, is it okay if she goes first?
Of course. Who is who? Oh, Galaxy 850, A50, right?
Yeah.
Oops, unmute, unmute. Sorry, 1 second. Here we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, state your name.
Okay. Joy Simmons, the Chief of Staff for New York City Council Member Inez Barron.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Oh,
Thank you for this. I'm sorry. So I just said good afternoon and thank you for holding this hearing. And great work. We're all making the necessary adjustments. As you may know, Councilmember Inez Barron has tested positive for coronavirus. And her husband, Assemblyman Charles Barron, also tested positive and was in the hospital. He was recently released and is recovering. So as you can imagine, there's a lot happening. Lots of people in our district are dying from coronavirus. So Councilmember Barron sort of passed her hands very full, trying to deal with a lot of matters, or she would be here on this call today. So she asked me to participate on her behalf. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I am going to read the letter that Councilmember Barron wrote and signed in support of the Jean's Place project. Just to note, I was able to listen in on the beginning of the hearing when I did hear some of the different concerns. And I just wanted to say that one, we did express our desire to make sure that all issues regarding sound was resolved, because we want to make sure that residents are comfortable and are not disturbed by the train sound. And we also, so in all of that, in terms of, because I know a few things was mentioned about the sound and the height, and also some other issues in terms of the unit sizes, et cetera. So just to note that we have not agreed to anything that was final on that end. And so the developer agreed to work with us to make sure that all of those issues were going to be resolved, and that we could work together to come up with a design and a final project that was appropriate for the site. And so we've had done a lot of work with the developer in the past, and they have proven they've proven themselves to work with us and to respond to the concerns that were raised. So I just wanted to say that. And so I'm just going to quickly read the letter that Councilmember Barron would like to put forth. Dear Chair and Commissioners, affordable housing is a citywide problem that is particularly acute for low-income and homeless seniors needing supportive services. In its soft commitment letter for the project that is before you, HPD stated that the development of housing for homeless and low-income seniors is an HPD priority. The issue is a priority for me, my colleagues at the City Council, and my constituents as well. The proposed project will provide 129 units of permanently affordable senior housing together with a range of support services, and deserves the board's expeditious approval. CCM is an established social service organization that is vitally important to the community I serve. It currently assists approximately 225,000 individuals and families a year through more than 75 programs addressing homelessness, health and mental health services, youth and education empowerment, and affordable supportive housing. CCM has the experience to carry out the proposed project. It has successfully developed 4 permanently affordable supportive housing facilities in Brooklyn. The most recent development, Beverly's Place, 72 units, is located adjacent to the subject premises. Collectively, housing developed by CCM serves families in which a member has AIDS, formerly homeless seniors, homeless persons with mental illness and/or substance abuse problems, and eligible low-income community members. The New York Housing Conference, an affordable housing policy and advocacy organization, has nominated Beverly's Place for an award, describing it as bringing affordable and supportive housing together with vital support services into a building that reflects contemporary life and helps residents establish a sense of well-being and self-worth, establishing a model for combating homelessness. I congratulate CCM and Emery Brooks, its founder, president, and CEO, on this well-deserved honor. The project before the board, known as Jean's Place, would be developed adjacent to Beverly's Place on a vacant lot in an M1-1 light manufacturing district. However, there is no manufacturing on the subject block, which is split into 3 districts: R6, C4-4L, which is an R7 equivalent, and M1-1, with the exception of a community facility. The block is entirely residential. Jean's Place would be developed substantially in accordance with the adjacent R6 zoning regulations, including the affordable independent residences for seniors, the AIRS program. The application before you is critically important to the community, and it will serve, the community it will serve, and can be a model for combating poverty among our growing senior population. I strongly urge its approval. Please let me know if my office can provide any additional information to assist the board in this matter. Thank you. Sincerely, Councilmember Inez Barron.
Thank you. I do have a question. So answered by the letter. I appreciate it, and I want to add, please send Ms. Barron and Councilmember Barron and her husband our best wishes for free. My question had to do with the fact that the site is in an industrial business zone, and just to make sure that you're aware that this is having an effect on the business zone, and you're good to go about that.
So yeah, so the way that the site is, it's almost like it's a cutout into a residential area. So we wanted to make sure that the site was in character with the community. Mm-hmm. And so we do support it, becoming a residential area and site. Now, we did work with them to come up with a plan to add some features on it, such as a rooftop garden, et cetera, that can, answer to some kind of light mixed and use. And so that was something that, they agreed to, and they were working on that. And that is a feature that we think could strikes a good balance. But the site, we do have a lot of vacant lots in that area. And so we want to get rid of the blight because that particular block is just really, it doesn't appear to be that it's going to be a good site for manufacturing and business, considering that residential is all around it. And we wouldn't want to have, manufacturing going on there, heavy manufacturing really. Mm-hmm. Going on there with the residential area. So we think what they were proposing was a good balance.
Okay, great. Thank you. Is there anything else you want to add? And feel free to stay online with us as we talk about it. We really do appreciate you calling in. It's very helpful. Yes.
Yeah, so just that when you talked earlier about the design, et cetera, we just want you to know that we want the best for the community as well. And so we will continue to work with them to make sure that all of the legitimate concerns, are addressed, and that the design, that all of the elements, all of the aspects of the project are serving the community. And so we do appreciate the concerns that I've heard that you all brought up. And we think that CCM if they're going to continue to do what they've done in the past, they will be responsive and work with us to address those concerns.
Okay, but just in case you're not aware of it, so the application, however it's shaped, right? Like for right now, the building, it has a particular shape. And assuming it stays that way, but I had a lot of questions about whether that's the right shape, but anyway, assuming it stays that way, that would be what it would be approved by the board, right? So if you and your constituents have a different idea about what should be provided, you should let us know, because that is something then that we could discuss with the applicant. Because once the shape and the siting of the building on this, the siting of the building is determined by this board, that's what HPD would be looking at, for one, as an approved project. If for them to come back and change anything would be very complicated. It would likely mean they'd have to come back and refile another application. And if the otherwise it would go to the Department of Buildings the way we approve it. So if you have other ideas, we need to hear about them as soon as possible, okay? And I understand this is a difficult time and so on, but to please let us know, and of course let the applicant know, so that their next submission and the next hearing will incorporate those kinds of comments from you and your constituents, okay?
Okay, thank you.
And I'm going to recognize Commissioner Shanda, who is closely related to HPD type projects, emotionally and professionally.
Yes.
Emotionally
attached to it.
You have,
but
Commissioner Shanda, there's something wrong with your transmission, or maybe it's mine. Everyone's moving around except you. She's frozen. So
She's breaking up. That's why.
She needs.
Can you hear me?
And
yeah,
we can hear you, but your video is frozen. So speak, unless it reverberates. Okay. There you are. You're back. Okay. You're back. Can you hear us? No. No, we can't hear you.
I'm fine.
Okay. We can't hear you. So I'll recognize you after you come back. And let's move on, Mr. Schnackenberg.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Ms. Simmons, if you're still on the call. I know that Howard Goldman from our offices was going to address the board first. He's now on. So with your permission, Madam Chair, I'll defer to Mr. Goldman.
Okay.
Sorry. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Thank you, everybody. We're very happy to be working with the board on this project.
Sorry, Howard, you need to be sworn in by Tony. You missed the swearing in ceremony before.
I did.
Yeah.
Raise your right hand, Howard. Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in your testimony before this board, and to respond honestly to board member questions?
Yes, I do.
Okay, proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll keep it brief because the board raised some good questions, and I want to give the rest of the team an opportunity to respond. And I also want to wish Council Member Barron and Assembly Member Barron a very speedy and healthy recovery. And I thank them for having their Chief of Staff participate in this hearing. My firm we're very proud to be working on this project for two main reasons. One, because it involves senior housing, and there is a crisis in the city of New York over the lack of affordable senior housing, particularly where support services are involved. A February 10th, 2020 Crain's op-ed said that of the roughly 1.1 million people over 65 in the city, 20% are living in poverty. This is over 200,000 people. By 2040, the Crain's article said that it is anticipated that that the number of people over 65 will reach 2 million, which at that point would exceed the number of children in the school system. So it's a very serious issue. I'm glad that we all have an opportunity to do something about it. This project, I guess, as you know, would provide 129 units of permanently affordable senior housing, together with an innovative and extensive array of supportive services, and it would serve low-income and very low-income persons. It will not solve the problem, obviously, of senior housing, but it will make a major contribution, and it can serve as a model for facilities in the future. The second reason we're very pleased to be working on this has to do with CCM, Community Counseling and Mediation. They are a nonprofit organization. They were founded in 1982, 38 years ago, by Emery Brooks, who is going to testify to the board. Mr. Brooks currently serves as its president and its CEO. They currently serve over 25,000 families and individuals a year, primarily in the poorest neighborhoods in Brooklyn. And they have an annual budget of 17 million and a staff of over 270 people. So they are an established, functioning organization. In addition to the social services that they provide, they have developed and operate 4 supportive housing facilities in Brooklyn. The newest one, which we call Beverly's Place, is directly adjacent to the subject premises, but it's in an R6 district because the block is split into different zoning districts. As mentioned by the council members' staff person, Beverly's Place is currently nominated for an award for setting an example for how senior housing can operate in this city. The subject premises and Beverly's Place were both acquired by CCM at the request of HPD in 2015. Now, HPD could have asked any number of affordable housing developers, but they asked CCM. And if nothing else, this shows the confidence and that HPD has in CCM and their ability to carry this project out if it's approved by the board. HPD issued a soft commitment letter for this project, which we forwarded to the board. It will be financed under the Senior Affordable Rental Apartment Program of HPD, which they call the SARA program. As you've also heard, every effort has been made to meet the R6 bulk regulations of the adjacent district, as well as the Affordable Independent Residences for Seniors, the AIRS regulation of the zoning resolution. And in addition, all of the units in the proposed project will conform to the HPD design guidelines for multifamily new construction and senior housing. That's a requirement. So having said that, I just want to respond to the issue about the contamination. Thank the board for their comments on this. My understanding, and AKRF can confirm this, is that the cleanup would be the same whether there was a conforming use or residential use. So I think we need to hear from AKRF on that issue. Finally, at this point, David, I'll hand it back to you. David is counsel to Goldman Harris. We're very happy to have him. And David, take it from here, unless there are any questions.
I have a question. So yeah, so you said that, so this is a question, and David, I think, is actually aware of this from our other project, the Catholic Charities Project.
Yes.
So in that case, they came to us with an AIRS project of a certain number of units of a certain size, also along a very, very long corridor and so on. And at that time, this whole concept of deference was nascent. We were inventing it as we went. And that project was unable to get any kind of a sign off. And this is maybe helpful to have council members representative listening in on this, because maybe she can help. We were unable to get any kind of a sign off from HPD about the design of the project. So what ended up happening is Catholic Charities gets approved the way they submitted to us. And then 4 months later, some small number of months later, it turns out that HPD did not agree to the design and that they actually wanted to rework the project very significantly. And there were some things that we could handle by a letter of substantial compliance, and everything else, we said, you're gonna have to come back to us, and it's a whole new application. It's a whole different set of questions, and we're not even sure what you want to do meets the deference findings. So they backed off, and I'm not actually sure what happened. I'm not sure what they're building, whether they're proceeding with the application as it was, or whether they're out of luck, right? So to not encounter that, and maybe it may sound odd, but maybe this is a time during this strange time where you might get a more receptive HPD to actually take a look at your design and give some kind of a blessing that the size of the units, the mix of the units, the layout with the corridors, the location of the elevator, all that stuff meets their criteria, because it would be a total shame, and not to mention a terrible delay in construction start if they disagreed.
Very good comment. We hear it and we will do what we can.
Okay. And I just want to say, Ms. Simmons, if having heard that, perhaps you and the council member might be able to reach out to HPD and see if you could nudge them to help out in this. That would be useful. Okay.
I'm unmuted now. Okay, so yeah, so absolutely, we will work with the developer and HPD to get that resolved immediately. So again, we don't waste time and for
money.
Yes. Yes. So we will reach out to HPD and make sure that we get this design resolved and finalized ASAP.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Schnackenberg.
Thank you very much. So what we'd like to do, with your permission, is we'd like to first allow Mr. Brooks to speak a little bit about CCM and CCM's history as it has sort of evolved from a traditional social services provider into a developer and operator of affordable housing. And then we'd like to return to what I see as sort of 3 threshold issues that I believe we can resolve today. Those are whether CCM qualifies for deference under the Catholic Charities extension of Cornell, which we believe they do, whether the board would be satisfied with us removing environmental contamination as a grounds for the use component of the variance application. And then I believe there are some significant design conversations to be had with our project architects, which many people on this conference know I'm not qualified to have myself, so I'll have Andrew speak to those. So Mr. Brooks, if you wouldn't mind making sure the camera's on your face and addressing the board just to speak to the history of CCM and your experience developing affordable housing in New York City.
We have 2 people identified as iPhone, who may be the same people actually, but the phone is pointed at the ceiling on both people. Okay,
point to the ceiling. Can you see me now?
I can see one
Yes, there you are.
who has a hand in front of the phone. I'm not sure if you're both the same people.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so all right, okay.
So you're
Emmett Brooks. I'm the founder and president, and I'm a licensed clinician. CCM was started in '82, mainly provide clinical services to children and families. We then added foster care, adoption, and all of the kinds of needs that a family would have, that an individual would have. And in 2000, I had Amy Laravere, who was one of the top financial developers in the city, was on my staff working for CCM. And she was just insisting that we must do housing, and she was absolutely correct. And she conceptualized and we developed Rico's Place. They won a federal award from HUD. This is families where a family member has HIV. And from then on, we became also developers. So we run a network of mental health clinics, okay, and supportive housing programs. The second housing program was that was George's Place that we developed in 2005. That was 48 units of permanent affordable housing for formerly homeless seniors. Then Ruby's Place in 2015, we developed, and that was a site also that HPD, we had owned the site, and HPD asked us to develop the housing program on it, and we said yes, and we, and I think we clearly did a good enough job that the next project, Beverly's Place, when we were purchasing Beverly's Place, which was already zoned residential, HPD had already evaluated the Jeans Place lot and decided that housing was what they want to put there. That's what the need was, and not manufacturing. And again, they asked CCM to purchase a lot, and they said they would assist us, take about 6 to 9 months to get it rezoned so we could build both facilities at once, Jeans Place and Beverly's Place. HPD reviewed the initial designs that we had, made recommendations, and they worked with us for a while. They didn't eventually work out, but that was what the intention was. Anyway, we're very happy to get to this phase. Jean's Place is named after Jean Goulson, a board member who died at 97. I tried my best to get this started while she was alive, but she's looking down now, and she's grateful that we're at this point. And I just miss her so much. I'm sorry. Anyway, that's where we are now, and we are very delighted to be at this point, and we will do what we can to finalize it, and so we can get started in building it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have a question. You said that HPD, when you were working on Beverly Place, HPD evaluated the subject site and wanted to have it rezoned. Is that what you said?
Yes. HPD was clearly aware that it was in the IBIS section, and that the city also owned the lot next door in the IBIS, and that's already has been developed. And so it was a natural one. They had already evaluated the whole area, and they asked CCM to buy this lot, knowing that we normally wouldn't be buying a lot in the industrial area because we're a residential developer. But they said, no, this is what the need was. And ideally, they wanted to see both being developed at once. And I have evidence of that, incidentally.
Okay, no, I'm just kind of curious. So what happened? They started to rezone and then it didn't work. They didn't pursue it, or?
They started working with us, and the person who was in charge of it left HPD and went to the West Coast. It was rare. And it kind of got dropped. I think there was some questions in terms of city planning. Wasn't quite for sure that they wanted residential there, okay? But that happens, I understand that. But we were stuck here with a lot in the industrial area. In case you were wondering, why is this developer buying a lot in the industrial area? And we weren't speculating and did that. We were asked to do it because of our reputation with HPD in terms of being, a good developer.
Okay, understood. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Schneckenberg.
So just to echo what Mr. Brooks just explained, as I understand it, the board's concern in the Catholic Charities decision was that you wouldn't have somebody sort of developer in a nonprofit developer's clothing, right? You don't want someone to come in, get this relief, and then sell the project, sell the site, sell the variance to another developer. Mr. Brooks' testimony was really aimed at addressing that concern, right? CCM has longstanding ties to New York City, and since 1999, when they broke ground on Rico's place, they really builders. Sorry, did someone say something?
Go ahead, David, go ahead.
Oh, okay, thanks, David.
Please. Go ahead.
Sorry, I lost my place. So
Thing is not-for-profit developer in or for-profit developer in not-for-profit clothing, and that's not what this is.
Thank you. That's right. So this is not a developer who this is not someone who's sort of selling the project, right? CCM has seen all of its projects from soup to nuts, right? Everything they break ground, they build the building, and then they operate and maintain the building, and that's absolutely what's intended for this project. Just continuing with the standard for deference, in addition to CCM's history, all of CCM's projects before this deference and now with this deference are targeted to low and extremely low earners. The units in this building will be rented to seniors with incomes no greater than 60% AMI, but indeed most of the tenants will actually have an AMI that's between 30 and 50%. No units will be rented to households with an income in excess of $37,000. And 29 of these units will be set aside for formerly homeless. So with respect to the affordability criteria, I don't believe there's any issue that CCM and that this project meet that criteria. And as to the life of the development, CCM is absolutely committed to this building, this project being affordable forever. And to that end, which is consistent with all of their properties, all of the units are going to be subject to long-term regulatory agreements. Those agreements, to my knowledge, have not been entered into yet. However, that is the plan. That's part of the SARA funding. There's also regulatory agreements from the New York State Supportive Housing Opportunity Program, which is going to subsidize the program. So again, those criteria we believe are met.
So just to pick up on that before I lose that thread, because
Yes.
we don't have a regulatory agreement in place, which is executed and recorded against a property, we have a standard restrictive declaration we used on some other cases that is essentially the same. It's just basically stating the same deal in favor of this project and recorded against a property, and it doesn't restrict you in a way that's well, it would restrict you in a way that was more restrictive if you weren't intending below 60% of AMI for the life of the project and 100%. But it sounds like the deals are the same deals.
I believe that's the case. I'll speak with counsel's office and review that before our next hearing, and we'll incorporate that into our next submission if that's okay.
Okay, yes.
Then sort of, no one likes when I start a sentence saying doctrinally, but I'm going to do it anyway. Right. So doctrinally, the deference that was extended in the Catholic Charities decision didn't cover use. It spoke to bulk, and that's a logical extension of Cornell. That's why our application was somewhat bifurcated. We wanted to address the inability to use the site for conforming use, sort of using the traditional 7221A finding. And to do that, we were relying on the premium construction costs associated with contamination, which regardless of the use are between 5 and 5.5 million, and AKRF is here to speak to that. And of course, this extremely narrow street condition, which is exacerbated by the cantilevered rail lines. If the board is comfortable with our application proceeding without the sort of cumbersome analysis of the contamination on the site, we are more than happy to amend our statements and to proceed along those lines, but we would sort of look to the board for that direction.
Okay, so that's fair and a great observation. And I think if you were to look at the very detailed brief that was written for Catholic Charities, its purpose was to show why deference in Cornell was considered appropriate in houses of worship and schools. And And in those cases, it wasn't just area variances, it was also use variances where they were, in our case, we have deference cases, certainly many of them, where a school is located in a district that doesn't permit school use. Sometimes they're complying with 7319, a special permit. But effectively what you're doing is you're saying the community has an enormous need for those public purposes. And it's a type of uses that often gets pushed back from the community. So hence it needs help from, needs help with deference. So I think you could just expand a little bit on that brief.
Okay.
Or even pull some of the language directly from the brief, and you would get there.
Okay, we appreciate that, and we can certainly amend our statement to include that. Okay, and our next issue, unless the commissioners would like us to address specific questions, there were a number of them. We tried to capture them as we were listening, but I think the next sort of major issue for a first hearing would be to talk a little bit about the building design. So I'd like to ask our project architect to sort of explain why our building looks the way it does, and then to respond to your questions, which we really appreciate, about how the design sort of might be changed. And so I'll let Andrew respond to you if that's okay.
Okay, before that though,
Yes.
Commissioner Shanda had tried to speak before and she was cut off because of the transmission. So I'm just going to unmute her, see if she wants to repeat what you said before when you got frozen out.
Thank you. No, I think we covered it. I just wanted to let Council Member Ines Barron's Chief of Staff know that when we do approve the project, it is not just the location of the building or the building form, it's also the number of units. So all of those are looked in its entirety, and any changes that are to be made that can increase the number or increase the degree of the variance, it should be factored in now. That's all.
Okay. And we always want to make sure that the units are not too small, but that they're also, you know, not wasting space either, if it's not necessary for, you know, seniors to have that spaces. Because we've had in the past developments come to us with units that were just ridiculously tiny. At the same time, we want to strike that balance. So we want to make sure that we comply with, what the law is, the policies in terms of unit size, and just, but make sure that we're also not squeezing people into tiny apartments.
Of course, right. I think typically HPD would look for mix of studios and 1-bedrooms, and right now the proposal is all 1-bedroom. So, sometimes just for financing and for other reasons, they may want to mix it up, and that can change the unit count to more unit counts. And so I just want all of us to be mindful about that before we close the book on it at all.
Okay. Well, I'll make that a note and make sure the council member Barron is aware of that.
Okay, and also the zoning resolution for these heirs units allows for very tiny units, so which I think was at the time of thinking of these micro units, right? It's sort of incorporated a micro unit number, which is actually much lower than the micro unit. I think it's 312 square feet or something, which is really small. So it's a number very low in the 300s. So anyway, to keep in mind what the zoning allowed versus what HPD considers to be appropriate versus what the community considers to be appropriate versus what this housing developer thinks is appropriate given management. So you have, at least 4 criteria crashing up against each other, maybe in agreement or not, right? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you.
Okay, the architect.
Andrew, or Janine?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi,
Name,
my name is Andrew Knox. I'm a partner with Edelman Sultan Knoxwood Architects. Do you want me to swear in or something?
Yeah, yes.
Please, thank you.
Do you raise your right hand?
Yeah, see it?
Yeah. Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in your testimony before this board and to respond honestly to board member questions?
I do.
Please proceed.
Thank you. You guys all disappeared, but that's okay. You in your hearing session, when you guys are talking about the pros and cons of it, of the project, you brought up a number of really, really good points, and they're very, very much appreciated. You need to understand a little bit how we were approaching this. We realized when we were developing this project that it was going to be very difficult to make it work. Obviously, it wasn't going to work with the M11, and so we looked for what are the nearest similar look-alike or similar zoning districts that we could work within, and that's why we chose the R6 as an idea, and that was basically the FAR. And then on top of that, we then we're working very closely with the number of apartments that we needed to get. And that's how we ended up with, roughly 130 units, 129 units plus a supers apartment. And then working within that, the next thing that we really tried to do was do exactly what you were suggesting, step away from the elevated as much as we can. The reason why we stepped as much as we could, but we were leaving a 30-foot rear yard because we thought it was going to be too much to ask to have the rear yard reduced down to 20 feet. If we can, we could certainly pull the building further away. In terms of the size of the units, senior housing and heirs, or senior housing, especially senior housing where you start to have people becoming caretakers, it's actually a goal is actually to have 1 bedrooms, which is a good size. And so what we set these up as really senior housing, 1 bedroom apartments. And that's why there are so many of them and why they are set up that way. HPD requirement for 1 bedrooms are between 500 and 550. These are 535. And then a couple at the end are a little bit bigger because you're given a 25 square foot bonus or extra if you're making those ones UFAS compliant. And that's what we did. The concern about the very long corridor is very germane, very real. We tried to make the center, the elevator core, we located it so that there was a good connection to Beverly's Place on the other side. We could pop it down, move it down a bay or so necessary if we had to. That could make the walk a little bit less in one direction, but it's one of the challenges of having a site that's simply as long as it is. Those are the main concerns that I believe you guys brought up, but I'm here to hear conversation or answer questions, I think.
So I have a question. Can you see us? So
I can see you now. Thank you.
I think you're on speaker view as opposed to gallery view. When you're on speaker view, you'll only see the speaker. When the speaker is you, you'll see you. Hey.
That's right. I haven't been able to figure out how to fix that in my phone, and I'm stuck on my phone because my PC, et cetera, but thank you.
Okay, so as the speaker comes, you'll see the face. The gallery view is this little icon in the upper right-hand corner of a whole series of little squares.
Yeah.
That's how you switch it to gallery. But anyway,
okay.
So my question is the following. I agree that it'd be much better to have 1 bedrooms from a personal perspective, just to not be living in such close quarters, especially now where we're really understanding what close quarters feels like. But that's really an HPD story, right? But my question about the location of the elevator core, I get from the perspective of what's going on the first floor, why the elevator core is moved over towards one side. But from the perspective of a 200-foot long walk, and we saw this in another application where it was actually much longer than 200 feet. It was like 400 feet. From the perspective of the ideal walk, you would center your core. So I guess my question is, isn't it possible to center your core and then do something so that your community facility access kind of bends around the core, so you don't have to have two entrances to the community facility, or maybe you have 2 entrances to the community facility portion, but there's a little sneak around at the back or something like that. And another part of this is because the goal is to create a good building, I don't think you should constrain with the setback regulations and all of that stuff that is imposed by all of zoning. This is when I get to the point where I say the residential is not permitted in the M district. Therefore, there are no regulations. Therefore, you don't have to look at the number of waivers. Design a good building and like pretend there isn't any zoning. Because
I can't believe you're saying that, but thank you very much.
But I'm not saying make it 20 stories tall. I'm saying stay at the height you've got because that's compatible with Livonia and all of that. But you have a weird site. You have a through lot more or less, even though it's not technically a through lot with Beverly. You have those private houses that you should be respectful of. Maybe the building bends or shifts or something is treated differently with respect to those houses at the back. Maybe there's setbacks there and not setbacks at the other side, something, right? But I think you have a chance to make a building that's much more responsive to your site because we're here.
That's wonderful, and I thank you very much. And I'm having the pleasure of actually thinking of some wonderful ideas that we could actually move this towards to make this respond to those things. Thank you.
Yeah.
We didn't realize that we sort of had that freedom, and I appreciate it.
Okay, so yeah. Okay, and I'm going to recognize Commissioner Shanda, who had her hand up.
I think, yes, there is the flexibility to play with it. I also would, just as a former HPD person who is to head the architecture team there, I would say we were often told by the financing team and others to do value engineering, and that was to come up with designs that require minimum amount of, structural complexity. So keep that in mind also, because you would have to get the financing from HPD at the end of the day.
Yes.
And I'm sure you know what HPD wants or would not allow also. So I'm just kind of,
yes.
And this is a reminder for me and for others also as to, it's a good design, I think, but there are rooms for more improvement.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I hear you very loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And by the way, so just to throw this out there, I don't want to create like a firestorm, but if 130 units supports this shape, the shape works way more responsive to the site, maybe you put in a few more units or, like that, right? Because but you have 4 units down on the first floor, which seems to be such a sad place to have units that face the street over there. So maybe you want those units to face the garden at the rear, or maybe you want that to be someplace else. So yeah, that's part of it, is like, that's part of it. And if there needs to be something to compensate for costs, maybe there's something that compensates for costs.
That's a very good point. Thank you. I'll certainly look at that and work with Rachel, excuse me, the finance people, in terms of what that balance is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Other comments? Mr. Schnackenberg, do you have other people who you want to have speak?
Well, there are 2 issues that were sort of on my outline to address. One was the issue of the IBZ, which has been raised, and I have a few comments on that. And the other, we do have our financial consultant to discuss the viability. I think it would be beneficial for her to speak with you, all of you commissioners, so that when we make our next submission, I want to make sure that it's addressing all of your concerns. So if perhaps, I know Commissioner Otley Brown often has the lead on this. Questions for Rachel. I'll let Rachel introduce herself, and then we'll field your questions on the financing.
Mm-hmm. Good. Go ahead.
What's you, Rachel?
Hi, Rachel Goodfriend with A. Layer Bear Consulting. So, we're very familiar with these types of situations. We worked on the Catholic Charities case, which I am pleased to announce is closing on financing this month and starting construction soon. But so for Jean's Place, you know, we have a mix of funding that combines the private bank loan, the HPD SARA funding, the low-income housing tax credit equity through 9% credits, and state capital that is based off of a per unit calculation. We also do have brownfield tax credits in the financing structure, which I know was mentioned before, but it is not in the construction period financing. It's in the permanent period financing because, you know, we can't get those tax credits until the remediation is complete, which is usually technically very close to when the building is built and we get TCO. So it is helpful for permanent financing, but not necessarily construction financing. So as stated, you know, in the financial memo, the 130 units, which is 129 income bearing units and 1 supers unit, is really the minimum unit count that we need in order to really hit our long-term financial viability measurements, which most importantly include that 1.15 debt service coverage ratio. And then on the other hand, it hits what we need to bring in construction capital. So the state and city construction capital, you know, is based on a per unit amount. So the more units we get, the more subsidy we get for construction. Let me think. I can address some of the questions that I heard come up, and then maybe you can add on more.
And
yeah,
Hartley Brown, so you can.
Hello.
Hi. Okay. So,
Everybody went black. Oh, there you are. You're all back.
okay. You're unmuted so that you can ask questions freely with Ms. Friend. Okay.
Yeah. It seems like all of the funding is almost like a delicate balance of 10 different sources, and that as you reduce the number of units, a gap opens up that gets larger and larger as you go down in number of units. So the question that I had is, how would you make up that gap if you had to? Or would it just simply be, since there's a gap in funding, we can't build?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. So it's kind of, it is really a balance, right? Because there is always like a gap we have to fill. The thing is with the scenarios of 125 units, 120 units and less, that gap becomes insurmountable. So that gap becomes a size where we can't bring in, you know, other subsidies from the federal, city, or state level to plug it. And we would be submitting a tax credit application showing a gap of a size that makes our application not look competitive. And then so we would likely not get awarded the tax credit allocation, which is like, you know, the main funding source in these projects. So it really is about getting that gap to like a surmountable size and bringing in state or city subsidy to plug it.
So when you say you wouldn't get the tax credit, you mean the low income housing tax credit?
That's correct. Yes, the 9% low income housing tax credit.
So I'm just trying to understand structure. So there's lots of people applying for these tax credits. They put together their whole story, and their story reveals that they have, let's say, a 5% funding gap, and they say, you know, be determined, and they submit that to tax credit, and tax credit, sorry, what about that 5%? Where are you going to get that money from? Is that?
So that 5% would usually be framed as some source in the application. So we, but what we can't do is plug that with a source that like goes over per unit limits, right? So in this, I think we have about $5 million of state subsidy, which is a reasonable ask to the state HHAP. But if we were to increase that, and that's kind of like our gap filler here, and if we were to increase that that subsidy amount for HHAP, which is our gap filler, the tax credit reviewers would see that as impossible to obtain, and therefore, you know, the application becomes not competitive.
And that's because the state does not give out subsidies of that high an amount?
Right.
There's
it
a
has to
limit
do-
to what they would give out.
There is a limit, yes.
And how about filling with bank loans? Low interest.
So that in a sense is also a gap filler, but you know, as you increase your bank loan, you increase your construction interest, or on the permanent side, you increase your perm interest. And we can only size the bank loan to an amount that we can support with the budget overall, mostly because of the interest amount, and also because the banks and investors have certain ratios we have to hit. So, you know, we can't bring in 90% of the source from a bank loan because the banks need to see other sources coming in.
And so that's where your debt service coverage ratio of 1.15 is a handy measure, because you
That's
have
correct,
to
on the
retain
permanent
that. So there's only so much money that you could use to service the loan, basically.
That's correct.
Otherwise, you would go under that critical ratio number.
Correct.
Okay.
Good.
That's the end of my questions.
Okay. Okay. Anything else you wanted to add, Ms. Goodfriend? Sorry, I keep mispronouncing your name. Goodfriend?
Good friend. I know, it's a very unbelievable last name. Yeah, I think that's it. Anything else that came up, you know, we'll make sure to address in writing in detail. For the commission.
Thank you. Anybody, anything further, Mr. Schnackenberg?
Based on our earlier conversation, would the board like to hear from AKRF about the contamination at the site, or would the board prefer that we pursue this sort of narrower avenue, which I do believe we fit in, and make our application based on deference in the narrow street condition?
I think it would just be a lot less brain damage if we skipped the environmental contamination. You're really not needing to rely on it. There's enough problems with this site. You know, the extent that there wasn't deference, I think there are enough problems with the site that it might even qualify for a standard variance without contamination. That which I mentioned was kind of news to me when I started reading this. What? It's also contaminated? It's a thing about affordable housing. It's always built on the worst sites, right? Okay, so I think that we're okay, right? Commissioner Shetta, are you okay with us skipping? He has his hand raised. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, I'm okay with excluding the contamination. I don't think it's needed. And I want to thank them for the material they submitted. And I believe they were generous that actually this site has another like sort of hardship or uniqueness, that very close proximity to the bridge of the MTA. So that could be one additional uniqueness, but I don't think both of these aspects need to be considered.
Okay.
Thank you. Then I just want to take one more minute to tie sort of this final point to, and relate it back to the issue of the IBZ, because I know that with the 7221C finding in particular, building in an IBZ, a residential site, is something that the board needs to consider. So the East New York IBZ plan actually talks about the narrowness of Van Sinderen, specifically in front of our site, as and calls it out as being really, really difficult for businesses to work with. And so something that we will certainly call out in our next statement. The plan states that a majority of companies considering the East New York IBZ area cited poor infrastructure conditions as a deterrent to doing business in the IBZ, and specifically calls out, I'll quote, the narrow Van Sinderen Avenue corridor where degraded conditions exist immediately adjacent to transit nodes. And I think that this both supports our uniqueness finding with respect to the narrow street condition, and also I hope supports the fact that this is not really a site within the IBZ that could be used for manufacturing. And so I wanted to call that to everyone's attention. Given that, and that we've had you for a couple of hours now, we do have a list of items that we will respond to in writing. I believe we do have a substantial redesign or somewhat substantial redesign that we would like to submit to you. And so if the commissioners have no further questions, we're certainly not going to press our luck any further.
Well, All right then, so is there anybody?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. One of the commissioner had asked in terms of the staffing in Jean's Place. The staffing is completely separate from the staffing in Beverly's Place. Not only is there separate staffing for the seniors, but CCM, which runs a network of clinics, okay, will provide additional staffing support for Jean's Place.
Mm-hmm. There will be additional staffing support.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to unmute Commissioner Shanda, who had those questions.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks. I had asked that question, and I think this is something that should be wrapped into the narratives with regards to the programmatic need and the various service spaces that are being proposed in the Jean's Place and how it meets the deference arguments and other things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fair.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add to that. So one of the problems there, which was discussed quite a lot on the Catholic Charities case, was the extent of the community facility space on the ground floor. And to make it clear, that community facility space had to be related to the heirs, because this deference variance, this variance based on deference is exclusively for this low income housing and not for anything else, right? And the reason in the case of heirs housing and also other types of housing, there's a requirement that you provide a certain amount of community facility space, and also quality housing regulations require a certain amount of community facility space. And so that's just meeting the zoning requirements for that use, but there's not to be any secondary, or let's say any other use that's not directly accessory to the housing. That's all this is. So we need to make very clear in the paperwork that that's what the ground floor is being used for. And also back to the architect, to Mr. Knox, my question had to do with the elevator. There's this one elevator that only stops on the roof. And I was thinking that's somehow related to the horticulture use. And if that's the case, then clarify, which I get, loading plants and that kind of stuff in a mess. But then we were talking about the location of the core relative to the long walk, which we don't have to go through again.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, anything else? Anybody else? I'm lowering Commissioner Shanda's hand. Okay, nobody else?
Fire department's hand is raised.
Who? Howard? I didn't see his hand raised. Okay, Howard?
I didn't raise my hand, but
Fire
I'm
department.
raising my hand to thank all the board members for persevering through this electronic version of a hearing. We appreciate it very much.
And we appreciate very much the participation of everyone on your team and of the council members representative and so on. So thanks very much, everyone. I think that's it. So we will.
Madam Chair?
I think John was speaking.
Madam Chair, John Daly with the fire department.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to acknowledge,
yeah,
just wanted to acknowledge that the fire department heard your concerns about the site, and that I've notified operations and the battalion chief and the administrative company. So we'll be meeting tomorrow, and any comments that they have, I'll share that with the project manager and with the applicant of record of our concerns. Thank you.
Because my concern was because the clearance is only like 12 feet or something, according to Commissioner Shanda, underneath that elevated, that your fire trucks can't get there. So maybe the building needs to be pulled back further. I don't know. So
no, we do have our engineers on staff in operations, so I'll discuss these plans with them, and of course with the architect and the applicant and project manager. So hopefully I can get these comments back to everyone so we can not delay the job any further.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I just realized I also need to ask if there are any members of the public who would like to speak on this application. Kurt anticipated my sentence. And so if there's anyone, member of the public, who would like to speak about this application on Cinderin Avenue, it's 646-558-8656 is the call-in number, and we'll give you a few seconds to call in. In the meantime, I'll just let everyone know on the team that we will be sending you the next hearing date and the submission date. It seems we should give you some time because you have to work on a redesign if that's what you're going to be doing. And also on the regulatory agreement, which you should be submitting the regulatory agreement as soon as possible so that our council, oh, when I say regulatory agreement, I mean restrictive declaration, so that our council can review it, and if there's a back and forth, at least that part's taken care of. And of course, as much as possible, reach out to HPD as you're working on the design to see if you can get there some version of a blessing from them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right then. So I don't see anyone calling in, right?
No.
No. Okay. Thanks, Kurt. Okay then. Thank you very much, everyone. Stay safe, stay well.
Thanks, everybody. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This concludes the public hearing.